Now it's time to move on to the modern modes of ventilation. These are modes of ventilation that really became available in the 21st century. The first one is volume guaranteed pressure control. Tutorial 26. Modern modes of mechanical ventilation. This tutorial is about volume guaranteed pressure control. Previously, we discussed SIMV pressure control and why you might and why you might not use this particular mode of ventilation. I discussed how SIMV pressure control plus pressure support works and why this particular mode is of limited utility, but it provides a platform for understanding other modes in the pressure control canon. I also discussed issues with the flow waveform in pressure control in the operating room. This time I'm going to discuss a mode of ventilation that has multiple different monikers, but I am going to call it volume guaranteed pressure control. I'm going to discuss how to set up volume guaranteed pressure control, the limitations of this particular mode, and the applications, and why it is a really useful mode of ventilation, particularly where you have inexperienced people working in the ICU. A patient arrives in the ICU. Her name is Loretta, and you know absolutely nothing about the patient except that she has arrived intubated and sedated and is being manually bagged by an anesthesiologist. You connect her to a ventilator and you are asked, what mode? Volume control, pressure control, assist control, SIMV? Well, these are all conventional modes of ventilation. Is there an alternative? Well, I think it's fair to say that most ICUs have a default mode of ventilation that patients are placed on as soon as they arrived. And that mode needs to be nimble enough and configurable enough so that it can continue to be used if the patient deteriorates in terms of oxygenation or ventilation, or if indeed the patient improves. And there are strengths and weaknesses to using conventional modes of ventilation. For example, volume control is a wonderful mode of ventilation, and many ICUs use either volume assist control or SIMV volume control, and they use it for a really good reason. The tidal volumes are locked in. The tidal volume doesn't change with position, with airway resistance or lung compliance. Excessive phasic lung stretch is prevented, and the PaCO2 is tightly controlled. However, there are a number of drawbacks. And the major drawback of all volume control modes is flow control. It's very tricky because if the patient is sedated, flow must be carefully adjusted to avoid pressure cycling of the ventilator on inspiration. For the spontaneously breathing patient, flow must be sufficient to ensure that assisted breaths are synchronized so that the patient doesn't have flow dysynchrony, that they're actually getting enough flow, but you don't overdo it and pressure cycle the ventilator. On the other hand, pressure control has the advantage of flow dynamics. The flow increases or decreases to match patient demand in terms of driving pressure. Initial flow can easily be crafted to flatten the pressure curve, and as a consequence, demand flow dysynchrony is curtailed. I-to-E ratios can be easily adjusted without changing inspiratory flow. Mean airway pressure can be tightly controlled, and that is ideal if there is phasic ventilation perfusion mismatch in inspiration. However, the major problem with pressure control is variability in tidal volumes. They may be massive or inadequate or something in between. And the reason for this is that tidal volumes change dynamically with position, with compliance, and with resistance. And when the patient is assisting the ventilator, those assisted breaths may be tiny or they may be enormous. As a consequence of the limitations with both volume control and pressure control, ventilator manufacturers developed what they titled dual control modes of ventilation. Now, there are a whole bunch of different names that I'll get into in a second, but all of these modes are volume guaranteed pressure control. In the servo ventilators that are now made by Maquet, this is known as PRVC, or pressure regulated volume control. In the Puritan Bennett ventilators, it's known as VC+. In Draeger ventilators, confusingly, they have two versions of this: volume control plus autoflow, or pressure control with volume guarantee. In Hamilton ventilators, they have also got two modes: APV-CMV, which means adaptive pressure ventilation with controlled mandatory ventilation, and SCMV, synchronized controlled mandatory ventilation. And that is quite a mouthful. And finally, the Datex Omedia GE machines use another version that they call pressure control ventilation volume guaranteed, which I think is the simplest of all of these. But regardless, I'm going to call it volume guaranteed pressure control, and you'll see why I'm using this title in this particular tutorial. When we think about ventilators, volume control, you have two things that you control: volume and flow. So you set a tidal volume and you set a peak flow. In pressure control, you set a inspiratory pressure limit and a inspiratory time. In volume guaranteed pressure control, you set a desired tidal volume with a pressure limit but not a pressure guarantee, and you set time and you make various other adjustments. So these modes, they are so-called dual controlled on the surface because they look like volume control, but in reality they are pressure controlled, but not in a conventional sense. Although there is a pressure limit, there is no pressure target, and the ventilatory target is this desired tidal volume. But again, the tidal volume is not precise. It looks like pressure control because it's time cycled. Inspiratory flow is controlled. You have an inspiratory rise time or a ramp rather than a peak flow. There's a decelerating flow pattern only, and to a certain extent flow is unlimited, so the patient doesn't become desynchronous. So the paradigm works something like this. You put the patient on this dual control mode and you set up a tidal volume that you desire. You also set a pressure limit beyond which you don't want the airway being pressurized. You also set up a rise time, an inspiratory time, and a respiratory rate. And when you put the patient on the ventilator, it makes dynamic adjustments to airway pressure from breath to breath to attempt to achieve the target tidal volume. And each time there's a breath given, the whole cycle goes again. The things that you set that are locked in are the rise time, the rate, and the inspiratory time. It's important to understand that the inspiratory pressure level is constant during each breath. Once the breath is constructed, the pressure doesn't change, and this is different from automatic tube compensation. Once the breath is about to happen, it happens, and it gives a flow of gas up to a certain pressure level that hopefully gives the patient the tidal volume you want, and that doesn't change once the breath starts. But most importantly, in volume guaranteed pressure control, the airway pressure varies from breath to breath in order to achieve the desired tidal volume. So each breath is a little bit different. Now this is different from pressure support, because in pressure support, the inspiratory pressure level is always achieved, and the change from breath to breath is how much the patient generates in their own inspiration. In this mode of ventilation, the machine is trying to give the same tidal volume all the time with changes in the pressure depending on the patient's position, compliance, and resistance. Also, keep in mind that volume guaranteed pressure control is just like all other modes that we have encountered so far. There's an assist control mode and there is an SIMV mode. And if you really want to wreck your head, try and figure out how SIMV, volume guaranteed pressure control with pressure support, works. It works, and a lot of people like this mode of ventilation, but it's really, really complicated. In terms of setting up volume guaranteed pressure control, you set a respiratory rate. More important is setting the tidal volume. The inspiratory time needs to be set, the FiO2 and the PEEP, the inspiratory rise time or the ramp, the trigger, which is either a flow-by trigger or a pressure trigger, and the maximum airway pressure. So this is the Puritan Bennett 980 ventilator screen, and we're going to put the patient on this particular mode of ventilation. It's known as VC plus volume control plus, but it is volume guaranteed pressure control. And you can see here that I'm starting with the control mode, and the control is assist control. The type of breath is VC+, the rate is set, and then of course what makes this different from pressure control is that you set a tidal volume. And then the usual stuff, the FiO2 and the PEEP. Because it is basically pressure control, we set an inspiratory rise time, an inspiratory time, and a trigger, in this case a flow-by trigger. Now I want to draw your attention to two items over here on the right hand side of the screen, and these are really important. The first is you set a peak pressure. This is the pressure limit that stops the patient from damaging their lungs if they cough or they start exhaling wildly. And this is on all modes of ventilation, but it's particularly important here, and it's set at 35 centimeters of water. Below that, you can see there is a maximum tidal volume. Now that is set at 1200 mils. That is gargantuan. It's okay if the lungs are normal. We call that a recruitment maneuver, but just be aware that you may want to adjust that downwards in a patient, for example, who has ARDS. We can also use this mode as an SIMV mode, and in this situation here we have SIMV instead of assist control, and it's VC+. And what makes this different is now we have all the pressure support stuff. So the spontaneous type here is pressure support. You could of course use tube compensation. Pressure support is set at 7 here. We also must set the expiratory sensitivity, and that is set at the default 25% of peak inspiratory flow. When you are starting a patient on volume guaranteed pressure control, the patient really does need to be sedated, or should I say they can't be agitated when the mode is commenced, because the ventilator must make a series of calculations to make sure that the adjustments that it makes are correct. Once commenced on the ventilator, this particular mode delivers 1 to 3 volume controlled breaths with an inspiratory pause, and it does that to determine the peak pressure, the plateau pressure, and the compliance. And that's how it crafts the pressure waveform. And then the breaths start. And this is what happens. Before I roll these waveforms, just note we have a flow waveform on the top, we have a pressure waveform on the bottom with a PEEP of 5. The tidal volume is 450 mils, the inspiratory time is 1.2 seconds, FiO2 40% PEEP of 5 with a slope of 0.2. So when you push start for all intents and purposes on the ventilator, the first thing you're going to see is a volume controlled breath with an inspiratory pause. Then the breaths look like pressure controlled breaths. There may be more than one volume control, there may be 2 or 3, but the bottom line is when the mode kicks in properly, the breaths look and feel like pressure control. Before proceeding, I want to point out one other item on this screen, and that is on the pressure waveform, and that is the Pmax. That's that red line. In volume guaranteed pressure control, you must carefully set the maximum airway pressure. And as I've mentioned, this is the pressure where the ventilator cycles to exhalation if it becomes overpressurized, the patient double breathes or they cough. That is important because on volume guaranteed pressure control, there is a concept known as the pressure limit. And the pressure limit is essentially a way of ensuring that the airway pressure doesn't go sky high. And as volume guaranteed pressure control, it involves a lot of pressure adjustments to ensure that that tidal volume is delivered. It's important that the pressure limit is set very carefully in place. And as a consequence, you set a high airway pressure, that's the Pmax, for most ventilators between 35, maybe 30 centimeters of water. The ventilator will deliver the desired tidal volumes up to a point short of that Pmax. And it varies from ventilator to ventilator. In this situation, the Pmax has been set at 35 centimeters of water. On the ventilator that we've chosen, for example, a Draeger ventilator, the pressure limit is 5 centimeters of water below the Pmax. So when the patient starts getting the volume guaranteed pressure control breaths, that pressure limit is as far as the ventilator will go. And you can see here I've put up 3 separate breaths. The first breath doesn't reach the pressure limit. The machine is able to generate that tidal volume within the window between PEEP and the pressure limit. The second and third breaths just impinge on the pressure limit. And each ventilator manufacturer has different settings for the pressure limit. And these are just 5 examples from all kinds of manufacturers. The Maquet servo ventilators, the I and the U, the Draeger Evita, and the Datex Omida anesthetic machine all set the pressure limit 5 centimeters of water below Pmax. In other words, Pmax is 35, pressure limit, the maximum pressure that the machine will generate is 30. If you set it at 30, it's 25. For the Covidian Puritan Bennett 980 ventilator, that pressure limit below Pmax is 3. So if you set a pressure max of 35, the pressure limit is 32. And that might be higher than you would like. The Hamilton ventilators have a staggering Pmax of 10 centimeters of water that exceeds the P limit. So if you're trying to pressure limit to 30 on the Hamilton, you need to set the Pmax at 40. And remember that, because if you set it at 30 or 35, your airway pressure may not be able to be achieved and you mightn't get the tidal volumes. Here I'm using volume guaranteed pressure control in a patient in the operating room. You can see the mode of ventilation there, and the pressure waveform is flat topped and decelerating flow. The desired tidal volume is 450 mils, and the expired measured tidal volume is slightly above this, 469 mils. I'll explain why a little bit later. To check the maximum pressure level, I push the More Settings button on the screen and a new pop-up screen turns up. And here it is. This pop-up box gives you only 2 options because I'm using control. There is an SIMV version also, and so you'd have to deal with all the pressure support stuff with that. But here all we have are 2 things, and the key setting here is the Pmax, and I have set it at 30 centimeters of water. And if you were paying attention, that means the pressure limit will be 25 in this ventilator. This is a fairly high number for an anesthetic case, but be warned, if you are doing a laparoscopic procedure, particularly in the Trendelenburg position, it might be quite low because of the increased pressure within the abdomen. This is what volume guaranteed pressure control looks like on the screen of a Puritan Bennett ventilator. You can distinguish this from pressure control by 2 settings. The first in the bottom left corner is where you read AC VC+. This is the mode, as I mentioned earlier on the Puritan Bennett ventilator. The second setting is of course the tidal volume, which is sitting beside the inspiratory time, and this is incongruous on pressure control where you usually set an inspiratory pressure. Note also the rise time. You can see on this screen that this patient is on SIMV VC+ with pressure support, with a set tidal volume and a pressure support level. If you want to get very adventurous with this particular mode, you can always set tube compensation. On the Draeger Evita Infinity ventilator, there are actually 2 ways of activating volume guaranteed pressure control. The advertised way is to put the patient on volume controlled ventilation and then activate Autoflow in the settings. You can see that we have standard looking volume control breaths with constant flow here. On the controls on the bottom of the screen, there is also that strange combination of a set tidal volume with inspiratory slow calibration. It's not normal in volume control. And if you were to eyeball just this, you think, well, this is a bit weird, right? So this is volume controlled ventilation, but it's absolutely not. After those first few volume control breaths, the ventilator pivots to pressure control. You know these are pressure control breaths because of the flat top on the pressure waveform and the decelerating flow pattern that is different from the constant flow pattern on the volume control breaths. Now there is another way of putting a patient on volume guaranteed pressure control on the Draeger ventilator, and you start off with pressure assist control and then you add in the additional settings tab volume guarantee. And if you look at the settings on the bottom of the screen, you can see it's clearly volume guaranteed with that combination of a tidal volume, a slope, and the Pmax. It can also be set up as SIMV pressure control with volume guarantee. I often wonder sometimes if there are just too many modes on modern ventilators, but here we are, all the same settings as you are familiar with from earlier in this tutorial. This is the Servo-I ventilator that has been set up for a baby. Note that the mode is called PRVC, pressure regulated volume control, on this particular machine, but it functions in much the same way as in all of the others. The settings here are on a pop-up screen, and note the incongruity of having a tidal volume set but also a rise time. It appears that volume guaranteed pressure control has loads of advantages. It's a foolproof mode of ventilation. It can be used by novices at the bedside who are not used to making a lot of changes to the ventilator and indeed may make the wrong changes if they're not careful. It really does keep things fairly simple, and less attention needs to be paid to the patient when the patient's been moved around the bed or sat out, etc. It also avoids a lot of the pitfalls of both volume control and pressure control, while still having many of the advantages of both volume and pressure control, because mean airway pressure can be easily controlled and the spontaneous breaths are supported by unlimited flow while still giving the patient the desired tidal volume. But here's the crux of it. Volume guaranteed pressure control does not limit tidal volumes, and it doesn't really guarantee them either. Going back to this picture of a patient who's on volume guaranteed pressure control on the Datex anesthesia machine, and you can see here that we've desired a tidal volume of 500 mils, but the patient has in fact gotten 545 mils, and that seems to be a fairly frequent occurrence, that the patient gets a higher tidal volume than you expect. And it also works the other way around. Here is a patient who's on ACVC plus in a Puritan Bennett ventilator where the desired tidal volume is 470 mils, but the achieved tidal volume is 442. So if you're really keen on locking in a tidal volume to a very rigid level, perhaps this isn't the mode of ventilation for you. But there is something nice about the biological variability of the tidal volumes that I think works better in nature. And also it is quite a powerful mode, particularly where you have very sick people, and as I mentioned, the bedside practitioner may not be that skilled. And you can see here that this is a patient who's on ACVC plus and their compliance is really low. This is 17 mils per centimeter of water. That is really, really low. The resistance here is 19 centimeters of water per liter per second, which is really high. So this patient has high resistance and low compliance, and this is a bad combination. But despite this, you've set a desired tidal volume of 385 mils, and the machine has generated a very respectable 368 mils for this particular breath. So I think this is quite impressive how adaptable this particular mode of ventilation is, even in extreme settings. One other setting that's worth noting here is this, and it's known as LS or leak support. And while it may appear that this is a bit of a gimmick on the ventilator, it's not, because of the great value of using modes like volume guaranteed pressure control is the possibility to deliver an appropriate tidal volume in the presence of a significant cuff leak. And sometimes that happens in the middle of the night with a patient who is a known difficult intubation. So if your cuff is leaking, you can put them on this mode, put on leak support, and you will keep that patient pretty well ventilated until the morning. So let's just summarize what I've said so far. Volume guaranteed pressure control, very easy to use and fairly foolproof. Elegant solution for most of the issues with volume and pressure control. Tidal volume is guaranteed and pressure is variable but limited, and the breaths have the morphology of pressure control. Pressure and flow adjust to meet the tidal volume targets, but because flow is not limited, inspiratory dysynchrony is unlikely. It can be used as the standard mode of ventilation in any ICU for almost any patient, although tidal volumes are guaranteed, and in general inadequate tidal volumes are avoided. Tidal volumes are not necessarily limited, and this may lead to significant tidal volume drift, and there really is no obvious benefit using this mode versus, say, volume control ventilation in patients who have neuromuscular blockade. So let's just review this particular tutorial. In this tutorial, I covered volume guaranteed pressure control, and I explained that this is known by a whole range of different monikers depending on the ventilator manufacturer. I talked about the strengths and limitations of volume control ventilation, the strengths and limitations of pressure control, and why volume guaranteed pressure control attempts to at least overcome the limitations of both. I discussed how we set up volume guaranteed pressure control, how to use it, and some of the limitations associated with it. Next time, I'm going to move on to discuss volume guaranteed pressure support, how to set up volume guaranteed pressure support, also known as volume support, and the advantages and disadvantages of volume support. I'll see you then. If you're enjoying these tutorials, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or follow me at ccmtutorials.org.